take over.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again today for this webinar, Victim Safety, Safety Needs of Victims, Their Children, and Community. And welcome all of you back to our webinar series. And of course, I would love to be able to do this in person, but this is how we're doing it for now. So, I just want to say this in advance, couple of things. I feel so strongly about victim safety that I wanted to dedicate an entire webinar to victim safety and what that means, because we talk a lot about that, victim safety and offender accountability, but I wanted to sort of clarify, be a little more specific on how we all can participate in creating more safety for victims of different types of violence. So I also want to just put my plug in for the evaluation. You'll be provided a link at the end on how to do that. I welcome your input. I love the input and ways that we could improve our services and our webinars. So thank you. Next slide. So just a disclaimer that we have to have on all of our materials and products and webinars. Next slide. So this is on the agenda for today, the learning objectives. And like I said, I feel so strongly about this topic of victim safety that, we're dedicating this webinar to that topic. And so I welcome your input on various areas and your experience in working with victims and the importance of victim safety and how that's done in your communities, or what are the gaps, what are the concerns that you might have. So we'll be talking a lot about the related supports that victim advocates can provide. And the whole purpose of this project, this OVW funded project, is to link and to create better working relationships between legal services, in particular those that are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, to provide legal services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence, and advocates in tribal communities. Often there's sort of a disconnect between the two. So that's the whole purpose of this particular grant and project. So on my end, I provide the advocacy pieces so that legal services has a better understanding, and also victim advocates have an understanding about how to work better with legal services that might be located in their geographic areas. So I'll also be talking about trauma and culture informed safety planning steps, whether it's at first contact or during court involvement or even post-court involvement, and where children are involved. Identify things to include in a prepare to leave kit and why they support safety. So I'll be giving some tips on, helping victims leave a violent situation. Explain at least 4 protection order remedies that support victim safety, and understand how the different roles of a victim advocacy, a legal service provider, and a lay advocate can support victim safety. Next slide. Before we begin, I just wanted to clarify, and most of you probably know this, but I want to make sure that there's a little bit of understanding between the different types of advocates, and I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail. I've done a lot of this in a previous webinar, and I'll probably continue on during the rest of this project. So I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I put some a little brief definitions of different types of advocates, because we often refer to these advocates in different situations. most of the ones that I refer to are what I call community-based advocates, or sometimes I call them grassroots advocates. But this is just a short definition. This definition was put together by a group of us way back in the 90s. We wanted to help others understand our role, how we do our work, how that may be different from other types of advocacy. So this is the definition that we used. And I don't want to read it to you. I just put it here, but I would like to just call your attention to some of the bolded words. So we're biased supporters of women and also other victims of violence and also for the children of the women. So we're biased. We're whatever victims tell us, we believe them. We don't put an investigator hat on to gather evidence to make sure that before we utter the words, "I believe you, I'm sorry this happened to you," that I have to gather evidence in order to provide that kind of support. I just say right out, "I believe you, I'm sorry this happened to you," and I leave it to the investigators to do the fact finding and so forth. Um, we advocate for the expressed interests because domestic violence, for example, or even sexual assault, are where the motive is for power and control. Our work as advocates is to re-empower victims, and we do that by offering options and choices that they have available to them, and also support them as they make those choices and provide accompaniment. And I'll provide more examples of that a little bit later. So we don't want to assume what the victim should want or need. We allow them to make those decisions for themselves, and that's the way that we empower victims, because it's so important, because they've been impacted by the tactics used by abusers to exert power and control. So oftentimes they come to us very confused and feeling like they're unable to make really important decisions at a time when they have to make some pretty difficult decisions. So in this whole context, we prioritize safety for victims. And here we use the gender women, but of course this is inclusive of any victim, including male victims. So, but this, again, like I said, it was this definition was sort of came about as a result of the violence against women work that was being done back then. So, and also the development of the Office on Violence Against Women and the American Indian Office of that. System-based advocates, again, they have similar roles that community-based advocates have. However, they're more accountable to the prosecutors or wherever they're based. Some advocates are based in tribal law enforcement offices, so they're also accountable to their colleagues as their investigators gather information. The advocates, if they come on to information that they feel will be helpful to law enforcement, they'll share that with law enforcement, and they let victims know about that ahead of time. That whatever is shared by the victim, they'll pass that on to law enforcement, or if they're based in a prosecutor's office, they'll share that with the prosecutors as they build their case for prosecution. We also may hear about lay advocates, and that definition is provided here. The rules and policies there are often explained in tribal laws about their roles and their policies around confidentiality and how information is shared, or how it must be shared with victims' consent and so forth. But often we'll hear about lay advocates, and some of them are practice law only in tribal courts. So, and then there are full licensed attorneys that are licensed to practice law in whatever jurisdiction their license covers. So those are the different types of advocates, and then also how the work of attorneys are different. And as I train advocates, I really caution them over and over again to be careful not to provide legal advice to victims, because we're not licensed attorneys. We can't do that. We can maybe show them the laws, be familiar ourselves with the laws, but we're not there to provide legal advice. If it feels like what we're doing is providing legal advice, we have to check ourselves and make sure that we don't, because that's crossing boundaries that, because victims often place a lot of trust in their advocates, that whatever we share with them, whatever we suggest, they take pretty seriously, right? So we have to be careful about our professional boundaries and make sure that we're not crossing those. If you have a question, raise your hand. I have my awesome colleagues to help me monitor those things. So please feel free to jump in if you have a question. Next slide. Safety related hats worn by advocates. Advocates wear a whole lot of different kinds of hats. I did advocacy work, worked on the ground for many years, and oftentimes I just saw myself as just doing what I do because I want to be a good relative. In our cultural traditions, we're taught that we're all related. We're even related to the creation out there, that they depend on us for their life, how we take care of creation, and they in turn give us their gifts that we have to take care of in a good way. So we're taught, growing up, that we're all related. Even with other tribes, we're related. So given that, I often was reminded that what I do is acting as a good relative, and how we're taught to look after one another, take care of one another. So doing that, we end up wearing a lot of different hats, right? I ended up wearing a chauffeur hat. So I'd be driving the people that I'm working with, providing them transportation, for example, and also just providing them with support during different appointments. Sometimes I'd even help with their children. I'd provide some level of childcare as needed. I provided, as I worked in shelter, I even ended up being in the kitchen to help cook meals for the residents. So lots of different hats. Okay, next slide. So I want to do a knowledge check here every so often. And as we jumpstart the discussion around safety planning and accompaniment, a survivor is testifying in a criminal case tomorrow. She fears an encounter in the courthouse parking lot. What safety planning and accompaniment actions can an advocate take? Can you place some ideas that might come to your mind within your chat? What ideas come to mind? What can an advocate do to provide some safety planning and accompaniment in this situation? Very good. Notify court personnel, be a support system, request police escort. Very good, Thelma. Make sure to communicate this concern with, that was too fast. Have an enter and exit plan. Very good. That's an excellent idea, Amanda. Know your exits, know your entrances. Absolutely. So be familiar with the layout, right? Meet off-site, then go together. Very good. Thank you, Sherry Ann. Hey, Sherry Ann. So be familiar with the layout of your parking lot. Find out if contact court security to the perpetrator threats, alarm them or alert them, right? And current PFA status. Absolutely.
Bonnie,
Uh-huh.
just before that one, two comments. One was make sure to communicate this concern to the court, law enforcement, PD, escort the victim, arrive early, leave late to avoid contact. And then the other comment was find out if we can arrive earlier, accompany the victim into and out of court, and know what the abuser looks like.
Absolutely. Good ideas. Awesome. So it's so important to keep everything so transparent, right? Never leave victim alone. Escort to restrooms as well. Absolutely. That's a good one. Request a separate waiting space. Yes. And that's often, courts, tribal courts especially, are pretty good about that, although oftentimes the spaces are so limited, but they often will do their best to provide that safe waiting area. It's just critical for people to know that at every opportunity, there's abusers who will take advantage of every situation, right? Even in terms of looks and stares and body language. And if not from the abuser, from the defendant or respondent, whatever you want to call them, there also are family members that can also pose threats, intimidating body language, looks, stares, comments, all of that. So it's important as an advocate or support people to be aware of that. Yes, thank you so much. So there's a lot that can be done to make people aware of the possible threats, right? Because it's kind of like everything, anything can happen under these circumstances, and we've heard it all, where the defendant can run out of the courtroom, disappear, or lash out physically. So I think oftentimes, courtroom security personnel sort of know pretty much, but it's also good to remind them. Okay, very good. Thank you. Next slide. So ensuring safety and support generally, and what does that mean? Which is a hat worn by grassroots community-based advocates. Providing safety planning, creating tailored safety plans at every juncture in the service provided to victims. Absolutely. Things can change, right? Circumstances can change. Um, Whatever they might be, it's important to ask yourself all the time, is there a need to revise the safety plan? Is there something that we need to discuss and put in place to ensure that safety? Um, so with every change, it's important to create a new safety plan. Offer and provide emotional support and accompaniment during court hearings and other appointments at the victim's request. Okay. I think oftentimes we think we have to be there for everything. And yet there are circumstances where the victim feels perfectly fine, okay with doing this by herself or himself, right? So we want to ask if they would like accompaniment or if there's some particular concerns they may have. Um, if transporting, I always say, make sure you check out that vehicle, that everything is running okay. The last thing you want is to break down somewhere where you become vulnerable, right, to things that could happen to not only yourself as an advocate, the support person, but especially to the victim. So make sure your Indian car is running in good order. Provide information on victim rights, such as rights to confidentiality, and work to ensure rights are protected, not violated. It is a very important right to victims. I always say it's the cornerstone of safety. It really is. It's the reason why a lot of victims don't want to report, because their tribal communities are very small, and everyone knows everyone's business, right? And the word gets out, and pretty soon the abuser finds out what the victim is doing and becomes really angry and will lash out and threaten and intimidate the victim to where they may want to just forget it, drop charges, drop anything that's going on, because they're afraid for their lives, right? So confidentiality is critical. Facilitate healing options for the victim and the family, and that could be a variety of things at the victim's request. If you sense that maybe this person and they're really active in their spiritual um, spiritual things that they do, right? They attend a lot of ceremonies, and it's really okay to say, I'm here to help you in every way that I can. If it would be helpful to smudge, if it would be helpful to just give you time to meditate and pray, I can do that for you. So be aware of those kind of needs as you're working with a victim, because oftentimes strengthening their spirit, strengthening their mind can also help them feel safer, right? Acquire knowledge on local, state, federal, and tribal laws and resources. So I really encourage advocates, know your laws, do your homework, right? I always used to keep a binder of those, maybe not the full law written out, but the parts that are critically important that I need to impart and give to a victim and show the victim. So I would keep maybe a couple of copies of those extra, but I always had a binder that had relevant laws to domestic violence, so I could look at them myself. Nowadays we have our laptops and our tablets and our phones that we could pull it up and read, but back in the day I just kept a little binder of those, a folder of those. I had one in my office, I had one in my car, so if there was ever any question I could just pull that open and get to the right law. um And it's not so much to interpret it, but to have a copy, so that victim, if they're exercising their rights that are in that law, that they can even have the law written. And I had that situation happen where in some states, if there isn't custody order in place, for example. It's what we call, I always used to refer them to as mom's laws. The state has mom's laws where custody goes to the mother if there isn't any legal orders in place. So I'd even have those copies in my folder so I could hand one to the victim if the abuser tries to gain custody of that child or have that child removed from the non-offending parent. Acquire knowledge on policies and procedures in the legal social services, other agencies the victim may encounter as victim secures legal services. So be familiar with individuals in each agency, get to know them. Go have coffee with them, invite them to your office, or, if there's a group of people that are all doing the same kind of work, maybe pull them together and say, let's meet. Let's just talk about our cases, our mutual, like, just not specifically because you need consent to be able to talk about someone, but just in general, how they do their work around DV and how they do their work around sexual assault or therapy or whatever it might be, that you're familiar with all of those resources that a victim may need, and you get to know individuals, so you're not sending victims on a wild goose chase when you refer someone to a resource. Collaborate and coordinate with other providers to meet the ongoing needs of victims. And we can't stress enough the importance of collaboration, whether it's formal through maybe a team, or if it's just informally developed, so that you develop your own relationships and let them know about your services, let them know about the types of victims that you serve, the kinds of services they're often in need of, and that perhaps you may be in contact with them or making a referral of a victim over to them. And how does that look? Who will see them first? What's their policies? What's their sort of their belief system around these different types of violence? So you get to know them, because the last thing you want to do is refer a victim to an agency where they're going to be re-traumatized, right? Because that can often happen. So oftentimes within organizations I've worked, develop a resource list. And some of those have been developed by different agencies. So there's websites that contain resources. We have one under our sex trafficking website. There's a drop-down box that is filled with resources for victims, and not just trafficking victims, but it's also inclusive of sexual assault victims and domestic violence. So I invite you to take a look at that. It's called, what's the website? Um, s- uh, well, I'll drop it later, but it's a good resource. I don't remember. Um, okay, next slide. Yes, our home website also has a lot of good resources. Thank you, Marlon. So ensuring safety when the victim is considering legal action. Again, because this particular project is centered around that, is to increase accessibility to legal services for victims and to help legal services be more mindful of what's going on in tribal communities around domestic violence and oftentimes and sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, around the legal needs that the victims of those types of crimes may have, so that they can anticipate when they hear from a victim what their needs might look like and can then respond to those. So again, to assess victims' need for legal services that will support their safety and the safety of their children if they have any, and to anticipate those for ourselves, think ahead about the types of victims that you're seeing and legal services that they may be in need of, right, at different junctures. In my next webinar, I'll be taking participants kind of through a guided tour of the different, the civil system, the criminal system, and what advocates, what they do within that as they walk with victims through that. And there are different places where often victims will need legal services that advocates can't provide, such as if, they're being threatened to be evicted for things that they didn't do, maybe things that the abuser has caused. What kind of legal protections are there for those victims? So that's just one example. So anticipate what kind of legal services a victim may need. And especially those services, those legal services that would increase or protect their safety, because it's like things are so unpredictable. For example, if an abuser is violating the firearms laws, someone needs to know about that, right? That's within her legal right to inform someone that he's not supposed to have a gun and he has a gun. And especially if his behavior has been threatening towards her, someone needs to be aware of that, because that's where there could be an increased amount of lethality. Identify appropriate resources. Do your homework. Like I said, take time when there's a little bit of a lull in the work that you do. And I know advocates are always on the go. My hats off to advocates all the time, because I've done that work and I know. So, but when you can, it really helps the advocacy work when you need it to have that information at your fingertips. So do your homework and do that appropriate outreach by contacting those agencies and get to know them in person and know the full breadth of their resources, and so that you can then communicate those to the victims. So when they're making choices, like I said, when they come to you, they may be really confused. This is a really difficult time, and yet they're having to make all these decisions for themselves and their children about what options they're going to partake in. So it's good to give them good information, good, reliable information, so they can make informed decisions about their choices. Okay. Um, Provide options to victims. Yes, empower victims to choose. Explain the civil and criminal court processes. So again, it's important to know, again, do your homework there to become familiar with what that looks like within your tribal courts, or if you're working more in state court, to know how that looks, how it works, the inner workings, right? Know the judges. Who are the judges? How are they likely to rule in a lot of these cases? It's been my experience where I've had judges that are just really kind of pro offender, pro the protecting the rights of accused, right? And they forget that victims that are filing for these different orders have rights as well. And it's important to know your judges and be able to, inform victims ahead of time. Well, you have this judge, and he or she's been really well trained, and we've had some really good experiences with this particular judge. And where you see some need for a better collaboration, maybe the opportunity to work a little more closely with particular judges in your area, figure out ways to do that, to invite them to trainings that you might have, maybe suggest a good judge's bench book that you have, that that exists out there that could benefit them in their practice. So things like that, I think, are really important for improving the responses within our tribal courts, for example. What else? We have resources that you'll have the links at the end of our this presentation that you can access. And again, this is recorded, so if you don't catch those resources, they will be available. But one of the resources we have available is called a pocket guide, which helps advocates working with victims through the criminal court process, right? Okay, it's frustrating having a judge who is not knowledgeable about DV, and I didn't catch the rest of that chat. About DV symptoms and aftermaths. Yes, it can be extremely frustrating. Absolutely. And that's where, it's important to talk with your colleagues to see what can be done to help this particular judge. If you have one or several, what can you do? How can you establish those collaborative relationships? If you have a team, for example, if you have a domestic violence coordinated community response team, maybe inviting that judge to come over and maybe share information with the team, and then in return provide them with resources that can help them understand better. There's something called the power and control wheel. There's people that are like, I don't know, that's kind of outdated, but I still use it. And I think it's really helpful because it lists all the different batterer tactics that are used for batterers to gain power and control, right? So oftentimes that's helpful to judges or anyone working with domestic violence cases to be a little bit familiar about some of those tactics and the behaviors of batterers, defendants, so forth. And there's some bench books out there as well. If you go to our website, home.tlpi.org, there's some really good resources there as well. If you click on violence against women, I think there's a link to domestic violence and also to violence against women resources. So it'll bring you to a lot of different resources that we've developed over the years. Some of them have not been updated for the new VAWA laws. I think a good majority have, but there still might be a few that haven't been. So we have our ITWIG expert on with us today. So Chia has lots of good information. If you have questions, you can get in touch with Chia.
Thanks, Bonnie. I'll just go ahead and drop my email address in case anyone has questions related
Okay.
to VAWA. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. And it's difficult because you may not be real familiar, but as you work with each victim through these different uh, systems, whether it's civil or criminal, you become a little bit more familiar, right? So I'd always keep my own notes of things that I can do to improve their responses. And that ultimately led me to start to develop a SART program here in my jurisdiction, a sexual assault response team, because it was like we were so disconnected as people who are working on these cases in criminal proceedings that we needed to have a space. We needed to have our own our own times that we could meet and discuss how we respond and how we can help one another in providing a good seamless response to these cases. Next slide. Ensuring safety and support in civil proceedings. This is, for example, if someone is seeking a protection order, for example, and there's going to be a lot more training on this from my colleague, Kelly Stoner, and she's already done some of that, but there'll be more available. And if you have need for particular types of training in the legal area, feel free to contact us. Feel free to leave a suggestion in the chat of the kinds of training that you need. If there's a focus area, if there's particular kinds of cases that you're seeing, if there's particular aspects of cases that you're not quite sure of, that wrinkle that happens every so often, we're more than happy to provide a training around that, or even a resource, or just even having a meeting with you to talk about some options or some types of resolutions that we've seen in other situations. Possess knowledge of civil proceedings and options for victims. So like I said, this is our role as advocates to keep ourselves familiar with those proceedings, how they go. Oftentimes when I had time, I would sit in on other proceedings that I'm not an advocate for, just to see how those things go and kind of take my own notes about how things went, so that I could learn from it and, apply some of what I've learned into my work as an advocate. And also at the same time, I could see how it all plays out with the judge and, with lawyers up front and so forth. So I offer that as a suggestion as well. Back in the day, we had protection order forms right at our office, and there was a way, instead of having to take this victim to another office and be interviewed and questioned by, another complete stranger, to have those forms right in our office and help the victim complete them and then take them in to be signed by a judge. So that's also, I don't know what's going on right now in your communities, but that's also a suggestion. And being able to, provide the support to victims in filling out the forms to apply for a protection order. An advocate should not complete. Oh no, I'm not saying the advocate should complete it. Oftentimes, it can be really emotionally difficult for a victim to sit and complete it, and providing the emotional support is important. If the victim has questions about why question is being asked, then we could provide some insight into that. It's the victim's protection order. Absolutely. Provide support and accompaniment, continue safety planning. And we've already shared some ideas around the courthouse locations, parking lot, and so forth. Provide support to victim preparing for hearings and what to expect. Exactly. Oftentimes, defendants will deny that there was any abuse, or put the responsibility on the victim for any abuse that's happened. Well, she hit me over the head with the frying pan, or whatever it might be. And really being prepared to address that in terms of looking at predominant aggressor. Who is the predominant aggressor in this situation? So that it cuts that possibility. And sometimes bench books can provide that kind of insight to judges about batterer tactics, right? That he's going to assign blame to everyone else and not accept personal responsibility. Any comments about that? Are you finding that to be true? Like I said, feel free to ask or disagree. I share only from my own personal experience, and it can differ across the board, across the country. Sometimes the abusers will bring their family members to court, and you can ask there to be no persons in the court. You never know, it could be granted. Yeah, you could ask. I think there's in tribal communities especially, it's kind of a common occurrence. And you know, it's difficult regardless of how much work we've done to educate people about, you know, who's responsible when there is these kind of violence that's happening. We still see a lot of victims being blamed, right? Well, if she didn't do this, well, she cheated on him, and that just calls for more education, community education. And in criminal proceedings, it becomes even more important because you're also dealing with, you know, the jury. There's a jury pool, so your community is going to are going to be part of that jury pool. So it becomes even more important that as advocates, an arm of advocacy is doing education so that we're informing advocates as well as those in the court process, especially judges, about batterer tactics, for example. Chantel, it is important to also know that a lot of abusers are great manipulators and put on a great face in public and can make the victim seem to be the crazy, out of control person. So assisting the victims in being calm and collected is important. Absolutely. Um, I used to always try to sit directly across from victims when they were going to go up on the stand, and to say, just keep an eye on, keep looking at me, and remember all that we've shared, all that we've talked about. That, you know, these are part of what's going to happen, what's likely to happen. Yeah, he's going to make you out to be the crazy person, but just remember that you're not. You know what you're doing. You know what you want. Okay. Yes, April. We could make a note of that and I could send that to you. Bench book, DV bench book. Yes, good idea. They can answer and make their statements to the judge or look at anyone. Yes, they can. And in criminal cases, there's also the victim witness advocates, and that's part of their job as well, is to take them into a courtroom and kind of help them prepare their testimony and who's sitting where, you know, all the proximity kind of stuff. So that's also available. Sometimes if we've established a relationship with that victim before they have gotten to the point of being introduced to a victim witness advocate or a victim specialist, they oftentimes will prefer that we're there to just be present, right? So they know where they can look to get support and reassurance. Okay, next slide. In the criminal process. Acquire knowledge about criminal proceedings, the people that victim may encounter in the criminal justice system. Absolutely. Um, you know, they will probably meet with the prosecutor, anyone working with the prosecutor, if they have an aide, for example. They'll become familiar with all the people who, you know, the transcription person in the courtroom, the bailiff, all of those individuals. The one thing I found that is often difficult for victims is all the terminology that's used. So it's also oftentimes helpful, and we have that um, guide that can help victims or advocates that are working with victims through the criminal process. And I believe it has a glossary of terms of those terms. So, you know, any way that we can empower victims as they walk through these different processes, the better, right? Um, okay. It may sound trivial, but I also ask the victim to wear something they are comfortable and proud to the courtroom. I think it helps with credibility. Absolutely. My colleague Kelly Stoner often says that for to avoid things like raggedy jeans, and that it kind of sends a statement to the judge, right? That it, even though that's probably more comfortable for them, it's probably good for them to want to make an impression of some kind, however that might be for them. But probably raggedy jeans might not be a good statement. Prosecutors or victim advocates will want to know from victim what they would like to see happen in the criminal proceedings. Absolutely. And, I get frustrated when prosecutors want to meet with victims at the last minute, like an hour before the victim's going to testify, for example. No, we need to do that sooner. We need to give ample time to the victim to prepare and to know the kinds of things that will be asked of him or her. And also decisions that are being made by a victim, what their plans are in the future, I think are also helpful to anyone involved in these proceedings, so they have an idea of what's happening with the victim. Know the victim rights and the appropriate code for the jurisdiction. What does that look like? Accompany victims at meetings with investigators and prosecutors and court hearings. Meet in a safe location in the courthouse. Provide support through the forensic exam at victims' consent and choosing. The forensic examination is an important part of the criminal proceedings, right? There'll be a testimony offered by the examiner, the forensic examiner, and whether it would indicate that sexual assault has taken place based on the findings of the forensic exam. Continue, and I could do even a whole training on how advocates can provide support through that process, through the forensic examination, the role of the advocate, how they work with law enforcement, how they work with the sexual assault nurse examiner, how they work with other ER personnel, how they work with the courts, and so forth. So that's another whole training that can be done. But yes, that's one of the hats that advocates wear, is to provide support for that. Continue safety planning from filing a police report, moving forward, working with investigators with the victim's consent. Again, that's key to continue empowering the victim, because it's their case, it's their victimization, it's their story, it's their decisions. Okay, next slide. Support victim in preparing testimony and victim impact statement. Absolutely. And I've had victims do very short ones. I've had victims who even want to show a short video. So however it is, majority of courtrooms that I've seen, they're very open to whatever it is the victim wants to say or do in their time. Explain what to expect. And oftentimes there's victims who want me as an advocate to read their impact statement because they just are not able to do that. They're not prepared. They're not emotionally, they're not prepared yet. So I'll help them prepare it. They write it themselves, but I provide them, just support as they do that. What to expect working with victim witness advocates, so that they know that there's other advocates that can also help them, and they need to know the differences between our roles as advocates during this whole court proceedings, criminal proceedings. Provide support to victims in the final outcome. It used to be where if there was no further proceedings, the case is dropped. Prosecutors didn't want to be the one to inform victims of that, and they would leave it up to us advocates. And I would always encourage prosecutors. No, I think that it's a lot more beneficial if you share that information with them, because you're the one choosing that, making that choice to not proceed with proceedings. So and it's not what I always tell victims. It's not because they didn't believe you. It's because they didn't have enough evidence to prove to the jury that a crime occurred. And maybe if there's more information that comes forward, then they may be able to change that decision. Someone says they have the victim come to the courtroom weeks in advance to watch other cases. This provides an understanding of what happens in the courtroom and the judge's demeanor. Absolutely. Good idea. There are no rules at sentencing, right? It may be dismissed without prejudice. Andrea agrees with having legal terminology. I found that to be really helpful. And I always used to think it was cool when a victim could use that terminology in like in a sentence or something. And it's like they know their stuff, they know their business. Um, okay, next slide. Next slide. I'm going to kind of whiz through this one a little bit more quicker because we've done a lot. We're going to do more on this confidentiality and privacy. Next slide. I believe it's the cornerstone of safety. And like I said at the very beginning, there's a lot of victims that say, when asked, well, why don't you report? Why don't you go through that process? Because I don't trust them. I don't trust the cops. I don't trust, scanners, police scanners, social media, everything that gets out about my situation can get back to the abuser and then can then come back at me. They're concerned about that. They're concerned about their safety. So it's important that we put in some safeguards and ensure confidentiality. Okay, next slide. Okay, another knowledge check. Someone from tribal housing calls your office asking if Marie was at your office last week because her husband was asking how he could have her removed from the house. What do you tell him? What do you tell tribal housing when he calls? Do you tell him all of Marie's stuff? We can't give you legal advice. Tell them nothing. Absolutely. Tell them nothing. Even if you're working with Marie, we can't disclose whether or not someone was at our office. Absolutely. No information. Nothing, and report her to his supervisor. Report him or her to his supervisor. Yes. I would alert colleagues, right, that there is a chance this person might call again fishing for information. But this is where I say privacy, confidentiality is so important. There's tricky ways that abusers are trying to gain information. Um, and absolutely, we want to protect a victim from being, removed from their house or being evicted or being homeless. So sometimes we think we're working on good intentions, but often that could be putting him in an unsafe situation. So in some places, they'll say, I can't provide you with that information. If we happen to have that person, or we can definitely, or we can give you our own policies around what you're talking about, but I can't divulge any information about anyone that we may or may not be working with. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Next slide. And housing is like, back to that slide, housing is one area that often victims do need some legal services because, that's one of the tactics of abusers, especially if their name is on the lease or on the rental agreement or on the mortgage or what have you. But at the same time, there's those rulings can be made where the victim can occupy the house if she wants to. It may not feel safe for her to do so, but with a protection order, it could be. So every situation needs to be taken at its face value and what the victim wants and needs. But Kathleen said, now we also know the victim may be at risk of losing their home. I would give the victim the information to check out. Absolutely. You can definitely do that without divulging information to the caller, that there's some risks to their housing, right? This is the confidentiality provision. I'm not going to read it to you. There's just some assurances that we're providing the confidentiality provision to victims to ensure their safety and the safety of their children. That's part of our grant expectations. Okay, next slide. Privacy. This is definition that we use is the expectation that when a victim shares information with another individual, the individual does not have to go to be a professional. The information will go no further without the victim's consent. Okay. I take privacy really seriously, right? Because our communities are fairly small wherever we are, even if we're on a large reservation, we still have our own little pockets of communities. So I always say, be careful. I always tell victims, if I see you in public, I'm not going to acknowledge you because people know the kind of work I do, and they may automatically assume that you're working with me. And that word can get out and get back to your abuser who may not be happy with you doing that. So even that, I think about that in advance so that if you feel safe in coming to me and saying hi to me and so forth, I'm okay with that. I'll return that. I'll return the hug or whatever it is, but I'm not going to initiate it because I'm concerned about your need for privacy and confidentiality to that extent. Okay, next slide. Safety planning. Next slide. I say victim-centered, but I call it strength-based, right? To continue to be able to inform victims, they can do certain things to help increase their level of safety. That there are some things in place to help them feel less vulnerable, to help them feel less anxious about situations that they might be in. So to be able to anticipate and plan for those situations. Um, Assess safety, whether first contact is in person or over the phone. Really doing kind of a checklist of where they're at, where they're calling from, where's the abuser, do they know where they are, who has keys to your residence, and so forth. Inform victim of rights to confidentiality. Again, that's often behind in their minds, their concerns about their safety and who is going to find out about me reaching out for help. Visit with victim, provide emotional support, acquire information on their history, what's been happening, location of abuser, children involved, any previous abuse or law enforcement involvement. Visit with victim as to history of abuse, current abuse, who is abuser, their own support system, any immediate concerns, victim wishes, and their plans. Intake with culturally appropriate protocol. I say that when what I mean by that is, putting aside the intake form, right? Take the stuff that you really need, their name, spelled correctly, address, but this other information you can also interpret and put into the form later if you need to, if there's plans or any kind of things that a victim wants you to do to be able to you know, save that information and enter it later. You want to give this person your undivided attention rather than sitting there kind of like filling out a form is not the most culturally appropriate way, right? Responding to questions, taking time to listen, inquire about action or steps the victim has already taken, giving them a lot of credit and acknowledging what they've already done is really important. Again, that's strength-based, right? That they aren't just sitting there waiting for someone to take over and do this for them, that they've already taken some measures. And even the fact that someone going through some of these situations and yet still being able to get up and go to work or go to school or take care of their children, I think that's huge, right? And giving them that credit. And also, if they have reached out and acquired some services already, maybe finding out what those were they satisfactory? Do they need additional kind of referrals that will be helpful to them? Okay, next slide. More victim-centered safety planning, identify immediate and long-term needs and focus on immediate such as medical, for any injuries, their shelter, just basic things, transportation, children's needs. I worked with someone and they seemed really preoccupied. And I said, "You appear to be really thinking about something else or preoccupied. What are you thinking?" And her children are going to get off the bus at a certain location, and she was worried about them not being abducted, being taken by the abuser. She normally either is there to pick them up or walk them home, or her mother is usually there. So she was worried about that in the course of what was happening at the moment. So we went and attended to that right away to remove that concern. Take time to better understand what victim wants and needs, such as the victim ready to leave relationship. Don't assume things, right? Find out what they're thinking. Find out what they want in their terms, in their words. Listen for concerns about family and friends. An abuser can use family, friends to stalk, harass, or contact victim through phone calls, texting, social media. Abuser may blame victim or family and friends for their breakup. Most often they're not going to take personal responsibility, but often will place blame on all sorts of other things, right? And oftentimes will even threaten family and friends, or will keep the victim from seeing their family and friends, just to keep them more vulnerable and isolated. Understand the safety needs of children. If they've witnessed it, especially, be aware of that, and find an advocate that may be able to help them, or they may even need to be assessed by forensic examiner, for example, or a child at a child advocacy center to see if they've experienced any direct abuse by the abuser. Um, Explore, provide options to victims of safety, if safety options, if victim is prepared to leave, and I'll talk a little bit more about specific safety planning in a bit. Provide appropriate options to enhance safety even while staying in the relationship. Because oftentimes, it's victims who want the abuse to stop. They want a protection order, but still stay in the relationship. So some of those can be granted, where he has to stop abusing her and still be in a relationship or co-parent. Next slide. This was something that I thought was really cool when we used to do on-sites a lot more. This is pictures from the Kauai Reservation in California. And these are rock formations. And there's a road that separates these two rock formations. And on the left is the abuser. He's standing by himself, overlooking. In this other formation, there's kind of a little bit lower across the road from this other single rock formation. Legend has it that this rock formation is the victim leaving him, and the little rocks next to her are her children. And then on the right of her, left on as we face her, there's square stones, and that represents her boxes, her suitcases that she's taking with her. It's the coolest thing. Okay. Preparing to leave. Now let's check again. The victim tells you they plan to leave in the next few days. Her wallet, kids' birth certificates, and their medications are all in a drawer. The abuser checks often. She can visit a trusted aunt today. What 3 items would you prioritize for this victim, and why? And if someone were to be able to get a bag of stuff, where could they be stored? Any quick ideas? Yes, Andrea said often an abuser can file a false missing person report in order to try to gain access to possible locations. Ideas. What should victims think to grab? What's probably the most important? Her wallet, proper ID might be in there. Absolutely. Absolutely. Important documents. Sometimes birth certificates can be picked up pretty easily at the local health offices or wherever. But yeah, it avoids an additional step on her or his part to be able to have that. Children's important documents to obtain services. Yes. Sometimes some schools require evidence of shots and stuff like that. I don't know. It's been a long time since my kids were little, but medications I think are really important. Although in some situations doctors can be, good at providing a temporary refill on things until they can get a full refill. Important phone numbers. Uh-huh. Okay. Very good. Thank you for those suggestions. Next slide. These are important items to advise victims maybe to pack or for us to maybe help secure for the victim. I won't read them all to you. Again, this is recorded. If you want to take a picture of these are just some ideas, things that I thought about, things that I've helped victims obtain. Oftentimes children, I just seen the comfort items for children, oftentimes they're placed in a situation that's, different for them, right? They're going to be away from their toys. They're going to be away from their bed where they sleep. They're going to be placed in a strange environment. So sometimes it's helpful to grab for them a comfort item. Maybe it's a blanket, or maybe it's a particular stuffed animal. Oftentimes programs can have like backpacks where you could put some of these things for the kids so they are feeling less sort of fearful and confused about the situation. Keys are sometimes important, right? Inhalers, Andrea said inhalers, yes. Important phone numbers, wallet, phone, documents. I strongly encourage programs to try to get, the prepaid cell phones. If you have any funds at all that can help you purchase those, I think they're really important to provide victims, because often abusers will not allow them to take those or keep them, or somehow have access to, a victim's codes and so forth. So if you can get those, I would say that would be awesome. Okay, next slide. Some victims choose to stay with their abusers, and here are some ideas for safety planning with individuals that make that choice. Okay. First of all, to avoid shaming a victim for that choice. I've seen them really be put down for choosing that. You know darn well what's going to happen. Yeah, don't bother me if you do that. And you make your bed, you got to lie in it. Those kind of comebacks are not helpful to victims at all. There's reasons why, and they're oftentimes pretty legitimate feelings, right? They may feel that, my child needs both parents. My child loves their parent, the offending parent. My child, we depend on this person for their income, we said vows, we said some sacred vows that I want to keep. So a lot of different, pretty valid reasons. He said he's not going to do that anymore. He's done. He's not going to abuse me anymore. And they believe that, but then without proper treatment and, sanctions, whatever, oftentimes the abuse can recur. So it's important to not put shame on this victim for making that choice. Express concern for safety. Just say, I support your decisions. They're your choices. They're your decisions, but I'm really concerned about your safety. And how about if we talk about some safety options, some safety planning? Respect their choices. Safety planning, and we've talked about that, and you can continue to do safety planning. Remind the victim that you're there. They can come back, they can still receive your services. By them staying with that abuser or going back doesn't keep them from having access to your services. Next slide. Supporting victims' choices. Okay, next slide. Children who witness violence are very vulnerable, are feeling all sorts of different feelings, confused, like maybe they caused the violence. They may be experiencing physical harm, mental, emotional harm. Again, it's good to check out all of those areas as needed. And child advocates are pretty good about how to do that, where the resources are to help them to assess some of those things, especially physical. It isn't until oftentimes that mom leaves the abuser where they start talking about how maybe there was some inappropriate kinds of things that happened in a sexual way. So a lot of when I worked in shelter, a lot of kids were disclosing sexual abuse by the perpetrator, by the abuser, and it was because they felt safe enough to do so. Right, they were out of that situation, and they felt safe enough to disclose. May experience difficulties with attachment, regressive behavior, anxiety, depression, aggression, and conduct problems. There's research. One of those is cited down below. Some of the impacts of children witnessing the violence. They may be more prone to dating violence, delinquency, and so forth. May have impaired capacity for partnering and parenting later in life. So it's there's long-term issues for children who witness violence. So I always say, it's important for us to look at that when we work with people that, they're by whatever's happening where they're impacting their children to either be okay with victimization or becoming an abuser. Okay, next slide. Victim is not the perpetrator. Um, Oftentimes that'll happen where the blame can be reassigned to the victim, or the abuser could say, well, she started it, or she hit me. Look, I have scratches. There's also a thing, and it's still in a lot of tribal laws. It's called failure to protect. And I ask you to check your tribal laws if you have that law to work at trying to have it removed. It's where victims return back to the abuser and the children continue to witness that violence rather than placing that responsibility on the defendant or the abusing parent. They put it on the shoulders of the victim for returning and exposing their children to that harm. When they're not the perpetrator, they're not the one that's perpetrating the abuse. It's the abuser. They have to be held accountable. And oftentimes it's a tactic of batterers to threaten victims. If you leave me, I'll have the children taken from you, or I'll take the children, or I'll have child protection remove the children. So that's a batterer tactic, and the failure to protect only perpetuates those threats. Offender accountability: the offender is the perpetrator and should be held accountable. Separating the children from the victim can also cause them harm. Yes, absolutely. We believe that, there's a sacred bond between the mother and child, from conception. That bond forms early on, and that bond should be protected. And if mom has some problems with parenting, then find her some parenting support, right? And oftentimes some of that parenting the parenting skills can be impacted just because of all the stress and that mom's going through. So it's important to refer her to appropriate resources to help her with parenting, and also maybe some mentoring, right? Supporting the victims in making better choices through safety planning, having the children stay with a relative where they won't witness the violence. Okay, develop relationships with child welfare agencies. This is really important. Again, as advocates, we can develop those relationships so that entities that are going to be involved in the lives of people that we work with, that they're better equipped to provide victim-centered, culturally appropriate responses. And child welfare agencies is one of those that we need to work more closely with, along with law enforcement and so forth, and the courts. At all times, emphasize the need for safety of the victim and the kids. Here's where coordinated community response team can have a big difference. If you pull people together like that, anyone who has contact with victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and so forth, to bring a team together and meet periodically to discuss protocols, to discuss how can we close up the gap so that, you know, there's better responses, seamless responses, the better. Okay, next slide. Non-offending parent concerns. Just want their children to be safe and not witness the abuse. Abuser may be using children as a means to control the victim. Abuse may be happening to the children. Absolutely. That's always a possibility. And the disclosure occurs after the parent leaves the relationship. Abuser often accuses victim for turning children against the abuser. It's the abuse that's occurring that is not wanted, right? There still might be some love and bonding connection with the father or with that abuser, but it's the abuse that's the problem. Wants children to have ongoing contact with the abuser and have relationship with them. So supervised visits are critical at that point. Children may not want a relationship. There's always that possibility as well, and some children, the courts will listen to when they reach a certain age about what they want. And sometimes we'll make those rulings in accordance to that. Next slide. Protection orders. I'm going to not go into a lot with this. My colleague Kelly, who actually really put a lot of these slides in here, discusses a lot of this in from a legal capacity. So I think I'm going to skip a lot of these, and we've discussed a lot of this already in the types of judges that are hearing these cases. There is a way that, that tribes can even develop, DV courts and DV court dockets with that, which I think are absolutely awesome. And they're very rare. More so, there's dockets, but actual DV courts, I haven't seen many of them. So I encourage, if you have any kind of involvement in developing the need for these, then I would say yes, do so. We have some resources on that on our website, home.tlpi.org. Okay, next slide. Protection orders defined. There's the full faith and credit provision that VAWA provides or defines within their protection order definition. Victims can get protection orders through civil or criminal, through a criminal restraining order, injunction, as they go through the system. Okay. And it could also include the children as far as custody and visitation orders. So that's a good thing. Next slide. A little bit more on full faith and credit, the law, the federal law. Next slide. These are all the safety issues that can be included in a protection order. Okay. And these are things that a victim is concerned about. When you stop and visit with the victim, what's your concerns? What is it you want? These are all the things that you'll hear often from victims, their concerns, even with firearms. He has a gun. I'm worried that he'll shoot me. He's threatened to kill me. He's threatened to kill himself or the children. So he's restrained from any of these actions through the protection order. Next slide. And especially nowadays with the social media stuff, right? Or even going through friends and relatives to continue to harass the victim and so forth, that can be included in a protection order. Can also include pet safety, technology safety. Does the abuser have access to the victim's phone, computer, email, social media accounts? Because they can all be used to track location or harass a victim. So that's where I always say victims may need a burner phone because they need to have a way to call the cops when they need it. Okay. Just other ideas to address safety. So advocates' role, know the applicable laws, and I've said a lot of these things already, possess knowledge about where to obtain a protection order, have familiarity with the forms to be filled, share information with victims on the process, whether it's civil, criminal, provide accompaniment. Okay, slide. Discussion and questions. Any questions? There's going to be a series on legal that my colleague Kelly Stoner, my other colleague Suzanne Garcia will be developing and presenting in the next 3 or 4 months that I invite you to participate in. They're going to be excellent. So a lot of these issues will be addressed again through their webinars. I will have another webinar in 1 month. I don't know the exact date, May 18th or something. May 20th, I believe. So stay tuned for that. I'll be doing just how advocates walk through these different the criminal process, the civil process, and other areas, the housing and so forth, and what advocates can do as they walk with victims through those, and then also the legal services, what they can do in those steps. Questions? Okay. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Marlon, and he'll close it out. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, thank you. There is one comment. Some victims slash survivors may need legal assistance in addition to their tribal protection order to pursue necessary civil issues separately. Thank you for that comment. There are no Q&A comments, Bonnie, so we're good. And for those who have to jump off the webinar at this time, please make sure you grab your QR code displayed here on the screen, or go to the chat where our colleague Chia has dropped the evaluation link. And for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and proceed where we'll go through some of the resources mentioned, and then we'll also have this same exact slide at the end of the resources. So as a friendly reminder, here are our contact emails for our group. If you have an overall question, we do have a general team email here at the bottom, tlaps@tlpi.org, or you can easily reach us by using our first names at tlpi.org. As Bonnie has mentioned, our upcoming webinar is going to be on May 20th. You can use the same link that you registered to join today's webinar, to join that. And again, that'll be the third webinar of year 2 for our victim advocacy series. And we are TLPI, and we are a TTA provider for the Legal Advocacy Assistance for Victims, LAV, Expanding Legal Services of Initiative, ELSI grantees, and other legal services located on or near tribal communities. Here's our website where we will also post the link to the recording and also the PDF, www.triballegalassistance.org. If you would like to request individual TTA services, there is a tab, as our colleague and presenter today, Bonnie Clairmont, had mentioned, where you can fill out a questionnaire, and we can then intake your info and process as a team and get back to you as soon as possible. And again, our other colleagues, Kelly and Suzanne, would mention that there is no wrong door. Here is the information and URL code, QR code, excuse me, for the Tribal Legal Code resource, Victims' Rights, a condensed guide for drafting tribal victims' rights codes. Second, we have the pocket guide, as Bonnie mentioned earlier in her presentation, tribal victim advocacy in criminal cases. And again, this will be available on our website, triballegalassistance.org. To expand a little more on an earlier comment, our colleague Bonnie had mentioned our main website to Tribal Law and Policy Institute, home.tlpi.org/publications. We have our publications sorted by two types of access, one by subject and the second by series. For those folks who are interested, on the left-hand column here, and those who are viewing the recording later, we do have a DV cord stock, it's category referenced. And finally, here is our QR code and our link again for our webinar evaluation. Again, we appreciate your attendance today. We look forward to seeing you all in the next series, May 20th. Let me go ahead and pause recording.